Alright guys, we're going to pick up right on page 62 where we left off on our notes last time. Hold on, let me grab my pen. So, same objective, determine properties of quadrilaterals. I'm going to go right over here on page 62. And this, I would say, takes up about 60% of the page, this nice little chart here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the chart on my screen and slowly walk through what each little thing says. And then you can pause the video as you need to make your own chart. So this chart is called Properties of Quadrilaterals. At the top I have one pair of parallel sides, two pairs of parallel sides, one pair of opposite congruent sides, two pairs of opposite congruent sides. Opposite angles are congruent. Diagonals bisect each other. Diagonals are congruent. Diagonals bisect the angles. Diagonals are perpendicular. All sides are congruent, and all angles are congruent. Okay. Across the top I have the trapezoid, the isosceles trapezoid, the parallelogram, the rectangle, the rhombus, and the square. We're not going to talk too much about kites. We don't really have the time to talk about kites, so it is what it is. Okay, so for all the properties I'm going to just use a little different colors along the way so that we can easily see where each thing is bubbled in. So I'm just going to use blue for trapezoid. Okay, so trapezoids have one pair of parallel sides. That's it. Okay. Isosceles trapezoids, I'm going to use a different color. They have one pair of parallel sides, one pair of opposite congruent sides, opposite angles are congruent is not a fact, but we'll talk about one other thing of isosceles triangles that I want to talk about when we fill out the diagram. The diagonals don't bisect each other, but the diagonals are congruent. All right. In a parallelogram, okay, there are two pairs of parallel sides. Two pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Opposite angles are congruent. The diagonals are not congruent, but the diagonals do bisect each other. And that's it. I'm going back to blue for rectangle. So a rectangle has all the properties of a quadrilateral, or of a parallelogram, sorry. And a few more. Okay. In a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent and all angles are congruent. Okay. In a rhombus, that is all the properties of a parallelogram and then some. Diagonals aren't congruent, but the diagonals do bisect the angles. The diagonals are perpendicular, and all sides are congruent. The last one is a square. And in a square, it has all the properties of a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus. So I'm literally going to color in all of the squares except for these two at the top. Okay. So that's our nice little chart of all the properties that are the same. Now I want to draw a picture of all these properties so that you guys have them. Okay, so in an isosceles trapezoid, okay, opposite sides are parallel, the opposite legs are congruent, but there's one other property that we should star out here, and that's that base angles are congruent. So the angles on the bases, remember the bases are the parallel sides, are congruent. Also, base angles are supplementary. And that comes back to the same side interior angles. Since these are parallel lines, these two angles are supplementary. In fact, why don't we add that little piece into our chart here? I'm going to add in consecutive angles are supplementary. And I'm going to add that in for the parallelogram the rectangle, the rhombus, and the square. I knew I was forgetting one when I made this chart. So, in a parallelogram, opposite sides are parallel and congruent. Opposite angles are congruent, and the consecutive angles are supplementary. So that means that this angle plus this angle is 180. In the parallelogram, the diagonals bisect each other. So I'm going to draw in the diagonals in red. And they are opposite halves here are congruent as well. So the diagonals bisect each other. In a trapezoid, the diagonals are just congruent. So this is equal to that. Okay. Next we have the rectangle. And in a rectangle, let me get this so you guys can see it. In a rectangle, opposite sides are congruent and parallel. The diagonals are going to be the same length, and they're going to bisect each other. So that means that since they're the same length and they bisect each other, all four of these little parts of the diagonal are actually congruent. And then, of course, all angles are right angles and all angles are congruent. Okay. Next, we have the rhombus. And the rhombus has a whole ton of business going on with it. Okay, so in a rhombus, opposite sides are parallel, and all sides are congruent. The diagonals aren't congruent, but they do bisect each other and they are perpendicular. And these diagonals bisect the angles. So these two angles are congruent to these two angles, because remember, like the parallelogram, the opposite angles are congruent. And since the diagonal bisects these angles, all four of these little angles right here are congruent. And this diagonal bisects these two angles, and since opposite angles are congruent, these two angles and these two angles are all congruent. So we can already kind of see a whole lot of triangles that look like they might be congruent. Okay. And then I draw a square, but there's just so much going on with the square that it's just overwhelming as to all of the cool little properties that go on. Okay. So this is where I'm going to leave the notes. Hopefully they aren't too long. I tried to make them as short as possible. Remember, go back, and if you need to, I will leave the chart as the last thing on the video. Let me come up a little bit here so that you guys can see the whole chart. Okay, there's the whole chart. And pause it here if you need to. Have a nice night.